locked.
I think the only reason we could get to the other side.
I think on the side we were able to get to the side of the parking lot.
Okay.
There was a guy on the other
Welcome everybody. It's good to see you all. I see many returning faces, some new faces, which is very fun. We're very glad you're here. We're at the point in the semester where it's like a sacrifice to give away your Monday evening from homework and studying for exams. So we do appreciate it. We hope it's worth your time, but very grateful for all of you who come. Lots of snacks, so take advantage of those throughout the night. And then if you notice, we have popcorn and edamame, which is kind of fun. If you have no idea what that word means, it's the green bean things. But those are Loom. Some of you might have met him. They are part of, oh my goodness, what's the name of it? Who knows?
Island Walk.
Yes, Island Walk, which is in the rec center, but they do all the sushi on campus and everything. And he's an awesome person, very cool Christian guy, and he's been kind enough to donate some stuff to the evening. So if you saw the sushi last week, that was also from him. So if you see him on campus, walking around, anybody who works there, definitely just say thank you. It's awesome that they're willing to do that. Very kind of them. But aside from that, you're here not to listen to me, but our speaker. We've had Dr. John Huckstep before. I know many of you were excited to have him return. That's why you sacrificed their Monday evening. For those who don't, you'll see why he's great. I do want to list a few credentials because I'm obligated as the MC. He got his master's in molecular physiology from University of Hawaii, a doctorate in cardiovascular medicine from Oxford University, and then he was the former deputy of life science at the Air Force. So he's got more credentials than most of us will achieve in our lives, and he did it all in a pretty short time frame. So very impressive. We're very excited to hear from him tonight. I'm going to pray us in, and then he'll begin, and I'll hand it off to him. All right. Dear Lord, thank you for today. We praise you for so many things that we get to be here at this school, at this institution, even when sometimes it doesn't feel like a blessing. We are grateful for the chance to be here, to be in Colorado, where it's so beautiful and such wonderful weather, even as we begin fall, with the sun out and the mountains and the clouds. We just praise you for all these things. I pray that we wouldn't take them for granted, nor would we take for granted the opportunity to be here right now, learning about you, having fellowship, community, and great free food that was provided from many generous people. And so there's just so many things to be thankful for, Lord. So help us to be here during this time, engaged, intentional. Help us to learn, help our minds to be active, and to take what we hear and to apply it and to cherish it and be excited and not distracted by homework or exams or any other matters. But let us be here. So we praise you for all this. Be with Dr. Huckstep as he speaks. Help him to speak your truth and speak it well. So in your name we pray. Amen.
It's good to be back. Apologize. I'm not always gesturing. I'm just going to try to keep this wrist a little bit elevated. I had a little carpal tunnel work done last week. But it's great to be back, and I hope your guys' semester is off to a good start. And before we get into it, quick show of hands, how many of you all have a biology-ish element to your major? Yeah, how many of you are just kind of interested anyway?
Do rocks have biology?
Rocks?
Do
Yeah,
they have biology?
they do. There are things that live in and on rocks, especially extremophiles. All right, so we're gonna talk about some of the design inferences from the cardiovascular system. And so we're gonna engage in some topics along the intelligent design threads, and we're gonna give a little background on current evolutionary theory, and we're gonna dip into quite a few other things because the context here is gonna be really important. And we'll also wrap up with some stuff that I hope you guys can kind of take with you and help you along your journey. So take a look at these objectives, and I want you to notice there's an integrated systems component here. Now, how many of you guys, as mine students, work with, learn about, or study systems? All right, so I'm going to be counting on you guys to bring that knowledge of some of America's finest young minds to the table for some of our examples. So don't go to sleep there. But also, it's going to be really, I think, useful, hopefully, to you guys to walk away with some guidance on how to kind of navigate this individually, personally, and as you get into engagement. There should be also quite a bit of time for Q&A at the end, but most importantly, I hope this is an engagement that helps you to build, grow, and understand your faith and help you to be better at defending it and sharing it and have some more confidence in it. All right, now, if you don't mind taking out your phones, we're gonna do a little Kahoot. Yeah, no extra charge for that. And so this is gonna be a little bit of a poll. Let's see, how do here we go, this side. All right.
Oh, it's not a QR code.
So these are all gonna be true, false, and these aren't right or wrong answers. This is really to kind of get an understanding of where you guys are coming from. Okay.
There's a player limit.
Anybody still trying?
Oh no, there's a player limit.
Oh, that's lame. All right, so raise your phone. Well, we're just gonna have to accept that this is a representative sample of the group. So I'm too cheap to have the pay version. All right.
Hey, they get two.
So this is really just kind of like a poll to just see where everybody's coming from in the group. All right. So speed doesn't matter. And these are all true or false. Yeah, so how familiar are you?
Let's go.
Let's go. We're in, baby. Speed matters.
That was first.
Alright. So most of y'all feel pretty comfortable with the key concepts of ID. Very cool.
I was wrong.
Alright. GI84, I would expect that from mine students. Texas Instruments, fancy calculations.
Does anybody want to get a new team member?
Alright, so pretty similar. So a little more than half say, yeah, I'm pretty familiar with ID and current evolutionary theory. But it might be a different sample.
You know this paper, sealed it.
We're in. Speed matters.
You guys just always pushing false to your right.
Alright, so I think we're gonna take a look at this. Does current evolutionary theory sufficiently explain the biodiversity we see around the world? So we're gonna take a look at that in particular. Ooh, alright, so what do you think? Are your specific views? That's a kind of a loaded question because all of these terms are loaded terms, right? Okay, so mixed, right? Mixed. No. Everything's a competition.
I don't even know what to do.
Yeah, I wish we were getting the whole stuff.
Yeah.
Alright, so roughly split down the middle.
Right, it's an interpretation.
Let's see what your parents' tuition money is paying for. Wow, that investment.
You guys are just pushing false over there.
Yes.
I said the Earth is approximately 6 to 10,000 years old.
All right, so those 6 of you, we're all gonna be relying on you at some point this evening. All right, this is a multiple choice. Read them all.
Cheetos. Undo.
All right, home stretch. More than half of you are interested, that's good. So
Some people totally not our group might be picking false just to get points.
Not about pennies.
all right, last question.
Correct answer is false.
See what you guys will do just for points. Aren't all surprised about the entrenched dogmas in scientific communities and academia? Look what you guys will do for points. You will lie and say that you don't like Cheetos. All right, and red ostrich at number 3.
I tried to put in my actual name,
Number
but
2. And all right, so thanks guys for engaging in that. It kind of helps me and hopefully helps you guys understand those of you in the audience and where everyone's coming from. Bless you. Those questions, oops, that's the running in the background.
I say you just.
Those questions represent dozens of wormholes and deep waters that we can't possibly go into tonight. But we are gonna hit some of them, and we're gonna have a few focal points. Now, I wanna start with a little bit of background context and put this up here. So, looking at the natural world around, there's a question that can obviously come up. How do we explain the biodiversity, in other words, the range of plants, animals, and life that we see around us in the world, right? So that's been a question for a long, long time. Okay, so one of the well-known approaches or efforts to explain that was done by this fellow here. Who's this? Charles Darwin, all right? Now, we're certainly not gonna unpack all of his life history and all of his travels and journeys. We're gonna hit a few highlights of what I would consider classic neo-Darwinistic theory with a little bit of the background for context. So his basic theory said, hey, here's this descent of what he would have called concept of descent with modification. In other words, organisms had offspring that had modifications, and over time, these little modifications could produce changes in these organisms that ultimately explained the total biodiversity that we see out in the world today. Now, a couple things. 1859, why is this date relevant? On the Origin of Species, that's when he published it. So that's when he really formally put that out there, although he's engaged in a lot of debates and engagements before and of course after that. Now, some key concepts that are put forward there, he said, yeah, there are variations in populations, and natural selection acts on those variations. In other words, hey, if there's a bug, an insect that is a little bit more capacity to endure cold weather, and then you get a cold snap, the ones that have that little bit of extra cold resilience due to just this variation in the population, they would be the ones that disproportionately survive and reproduce. And over time, you'll have a cold resistant population. Those selective pressures continue. Right. Now, obviously there's a big leap to say, hey, going from an insect that's maybe, say, a little resistant to cold, or something that he looked at like variations in finch beaks, which we know can happen pretty quickly, 15, 17 years. There's a big difference between a variation in, say, a finch's beak and going from a head of lettuce to a grasshopper, right? So, another component that is key to this idea is, hey, there was one common ancestor that all life descended from. So these are the central kind of beliefs or views of Darwinian theory. And notice I highlight, quote, neo-Darwinian theory, which basically is what's most prevalent out there, looking at just kind of primarily DNA and genetics. Now, a couple things in context as to when Darwin was around. One, the understanding of the cell was very primitive when Darwin was around. It was considered a tiny speck of protoplasm and incredibly simple. Okay, that was a very inaccurate premise, and we'll see how that led to some problems that developed in evolutionary theory being sufficient to explain what we see in life. And there are some other things that Darwin's theory required, and that included, at a minimum, that there was gradual change that could be seen over time to explain everything we see in the living world. Okay? Now, how does Charles Darwin usually look in pictures? Grumpy, old, haggard. Well, he had a tough life. At one point, he vomited for 27 days straight as a result of some of his illnesses. But another reason he may look haggard is there are actually lots of problems and limitations with his theory. Okay? And I want to bring a couple of quotes that are going to be relevant to today's discussion. This was something he said in Origin. He said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. But I can find no such case. I think there are a lot of cases out there that would say, hey, you know what, your theory actually breaks down because there's no indication or evidence that this system or organ was the result of numerous small successive changes. And there's lots of content out there to unpack it. We're not going to do all those today. Now, I want to bring some more current quotes that are interesting. 1986, Richard Dawkins, in the beginning of his book, The Blind Watchmaker, Richard Dawkins is well known. Interestingly, atheist evolutionary biologist. Interestingly, does anybody know a recent change of heart in Richard Dawkins? How does he self-describe?
Cultural Christian.
A cultural Christian. He's recognized the moral bankruptcy of his worldview, even though he's been undermining the most important worldview for the vast majority of his life. And he also recognizes the need to be able to counter some of the destructive worldviews out there. Very, very interesting thing to dig into. Now, look at this quote. He says, biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So design inference is robust and ubiquitous in life. Living things appear to be designed, okay? Now, he spent the rest of his book trying to say, well, but they really aren't, okay? Now, most of the time when there's a strong inference we can get from actually observing things in the natural world, we are fully justified in trusting it. Okay. And we're gonna take a look at that a little bit more. Now, we're gonna take a look at the background and the development of the ID movement. And one thing I'm gonna tell you is that that was pretty dynamic in its initial development in the 80s and 90s. So by the late 90s, it was a pretty, or even mid 90s, it was a pretty active movement. In the mid 80s, it was kind of early in its development, okay? Now take a look at this quote from Jerry Coyne in 2005. So I would actually argue that that quote is based on trying to suppress the obvious design inference in living systems because of what was considered the threat of the ID movement. Now, a couple things that are very significant that the current evolutionary theory just really does not have good answers for that I want to highlight. And there are others. These are a couple of the big ones. One is the Cambrian explosion. This was where we had between 20 and 35 completely new phyla of organisms that showed up in the fossil record roughly 540 million years ago with no ancestors identified in the fossil record. We're talking completely new structures, completely new body plans, completely new organisms, right? And what would Darwin's theory require when we see an organism in the fossil record? What would we require before it?
Ancestors with
Ancestors with gradual progression to it. Now, are we gonna necessarily get everything in the fossil record?
No.
No. But if we have a massive explosion of new body type structures and organisms in the fossil record, we ought to catch a pretty good amount of that progression. And so Darwin was aware of that deficit, but he had faith that it would be filled in. Well, it hasn't been. Okay, so Darwin's doubt, as it's called in Stephen Meyer's book, has only become more of a problem to his theory. Okay. Each of these things here, you could spend months reading about. There's a lot of content out there, but I'll highlight current Darwinian theory is insufficient to explain modern molecular biology and biochemistry. In other words, the molecules and components that make living systems work and function have a complexity and order and arrangement that is very specific and does not lend itself to occurring by accident or randomly. And it's not his theory doesn't provide sufficient explanatory power to explain what we see in nature at the molecular and chemical level. Additionally, Darwin's theory presented an idea of, hey, natural selection can act on existing information and variations within populations. Hey, you're a little bit taller, you're a little bit this or that. And if there's a selective pressure, it can act on existing variations in the population through mutations. What does it not account for?
novel structures.
I was gonna say either, new structures that didn't exist or any structure to begin with.
Yeah, new structures or information. So, for example, if I want to go from, we'll use Carl's example. I want a warm-blooded organism. Okay? In order to be warm-blooded or thermoregulate, I need to have an entire suite of tissues and metabolic pathways and regulation and structures to do that. And that requires a lot of information to develop, program, implement, execute, organize, arrange, and regulate those systems. Just like if you wanted to build a robot and then add in a thermal management system, right? You'd have to add in logic for a control center. You'd have to add in a suite of sensors. You'd have to add in a bunch of effectors for heating and cooling. But it's actually a lot easier on the material side than it is in living systems. So Darwin theory didn't have any creative power in producing the information necessary to execute novel things in life. It could only make adjustments on existing information. Additionally, because it's incremental, if we have systems, or let alone systems of systems, it lacks the capacity to implement a whole system at once. And this is one of the things that's brought up in the ID discussion a lot, the term irreducible complexity. So systems, generally speaking, are irreducibly complex. In other words, if you remove one component, or even if you have all the components but don't assemble them and implement them perfectly, the system usually doesn't function at all, and if you're lucky, it functions poorly. Right? So his theory doesn't present a mechanism to produce systems. Well, all living organisms are systems of systems. It's just, we are, they are. You know, even the most quote unquote so-called simple, not so simple, unicellular organisms. Okay. All right, so a quick background on an overview of ID, intelligent design. Again, developed primarily in the 80s and 90s. There's a basic proposition, right? Intelligent design holds that certain features of the universe and living things are best explained by an intelligent cause, not an undirected process such as natural selection. So this is something we've heard quite a bit, an inference to the best explanation, right? So we go out, we observe something, and in trying to understand it, we say, what is the best explanation for what we've observed? And amongst other things, the cause that we posit has to be sufficient to explain what? The effect that we observe, right? So we're not gonna say, if we see a chair that's been built in a carpentry shop, we're not going to suppose that the goldfish sitting in the bowl in the corner, we're not gonna put the goldfish forward as the cause. Because the goldfish is an insufficient cause to build a rocking chair in a carpentry shop. Duh. Right? So this is a pretty basic concept in, you know, inferential science and lots of areas of critical thinking. Okay? And we apply it all over the place. Information theory, engineering, art. You do it day to day as you go around your life. You see things and you think, well, you know, somebody, if you see a donut on the ground, you think, well, somebody dropped a donut. And then you can think about, well, there's a baker that made the donut and somebody to carry the donut. And, you know, you can figure these things out and you can understand what a cause has to have. Now, I'm gonna throw this out here. Search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Anybody kind of into this stuff? Yeah. So SETI, tell us about SETI. What are they looking for or looking at?
Intelligent life out of
Yeah, indications of intelligence somewhere in the cosmos. And so what are they looking for? They say, if we find this, we have strong inference that there is intelligence. You guys can team up on this one.
I think they're looking for radio waves that like have a certain pattern to them. I think it's primary numbers. Something like that.
So, yeah, do you want to add? You're tracking.
Aren't they also just looking for dips in light from stars to infer possibly habitable planets?
Not SETI.
Not SETI.
Yeah.
But astrobiologists are looking for that in general, but not SETI particularly.
So
Specified complexity.
yeah, specified complexity. In other words, radio signals that are specified complexity. In other words, some form of information that is not, that cannot be explained as some sort of random emission from the cosmos. You know, it's not just some repeating decay signal from a quasar somewhere. Something that is has the characteristics of information. So for example, if I see this, right? Now we have a context to read that and say that is specified complexity, that is information. It's possible we could miss it because we don't have the context or the code. But that said, the mathematicians and code folks do a really good job of being able to understand, and computer scientists and information theorists do a pretty good job of being able to understand what is almost certainly information that had to come from intelligence. Now, if we looked at if we got a strand of DNA transmitted on a radio frequency, you know, that code of those sequences, they would, I'm sure, say, oh, we found intelligence in the cosmos, right? We find it on the Earth, and then they're not so persuaded. It's, you know. Anyway, all right. And another area that we expect intelligence to be behind is when we see systems, integrated systems. Anybody a systems engineering major? Anybody work with integrated systems? Yeah. So it takes quite a bit to design and tune and adjust and integrate and execute those, right? And even if you put all the pieces in a component but didn't execute and actuate them properly, it probably would not work, right? So we can see these systems and integrated systems and expect that there was somebody who did what for that system? Designed it. There was an intelligent mind responsible for the design of that system. So that is the basic view of ID. Okay? A couple things. Does ID make an argument for the existence of God? Really doesn't.
Not necessarily.
Basically just an intelligence responsible for the design that we see. That's basically as far as it goes. If you want to layer that in with other arguments and say, well, here's why that intelligence I think is God, you need to build that through some different paths and efforts. ID doesn't make those claims. Okay? Now, do you think ID is falsifiable? Okay, so we're basically saying, hey, there are certain things that are only produced by an intelligence or a mind.
If you were able to observe them being produced in the absence of intelligence or mind, then it'd be falsifiable.
I mean, yeah, and you know, there's already what he said more or less,
Yeah. So one of the critiques often is, well, it's not falsifiable. It's quite falsifiable. You know, show me a page of poetry or whatever in some whatever of these that you say requires a mind show it being produced in the absence of an intelligence, and you falsify it, at least in that instance. So it is testable and falsifiable. And I'm gonna throw this up here, and I want everyone to kind of read through it before we jump into systems thinking a little bit. Because this kind of is an amalgam of a lot of different pieces, and some of them I haven't dug into a whole lot.
Just had a question on
Yeah.
how would you respond to somebody who would say, oh yeah, I can falsify it with the I don't know, monkeys at typewriters
That's
response.
the thing point I was trying to say, where it's, I guess, I'm a computer science major, pretty heavily involved in software, and we're able to get weirdly good results out of simple optimizers that for a particular goal, which is kind of hard for
Describe optimizer.
its general category. I'd say most of the field of I'd say for example, I think most I would give a modern example to be modern language models have grown extremely complicated features and interlocking systems while primarily being developed through just minimizing a particular metric.
So
It's,
I'm not a computer science expert, but
that's
one of the
counterpoint.
one of the
So,
things you've described is intentional optimizations of that system.
That's the
So-
only thing I can say where it's the current argument I can only see is that the intelligence only has control over effectively the small means of configuration available in the optimizer, and additionally
So we can take a lot of systems and adjust them and optimize them to produce things. And depending on the level of engagement and optimization, will often determine what kind of output we expect. But that's not random. Alright. So this is a pretty wide set of points, and I've gone broader than the topic because all of this context is actually really, really important, okay? So this is some of the background and things that we're gonna specifically look at. Here are things that are most, and in many cases more broadly relevant, I think, to the topic. As a Christian, if you're a Christian, you should have a high level of confidence in a couple things. One, that the history of modern science springs out of, not exclusively, but primarily the Christian West. It simply does, it's a matter of history. I've given just a few examples: Galileo, Newton, Bacon, Pascal, Occam, Kepler, Hales, cardiovascular physiologist, many others. Scientific method often attributed to Francis Bacon. So that's a Christian development. Okay? The shift towards the view that science has to be all naturalistic is very recent, and it's an ideologically driven movement. So that's a recent shift. It does not represent the rich history of science. And that view of methodological naturalism, which basically says we can only look at or accept fully naturalistic explanations for everything we see, that's an ideological view. Now, I want you to understand that methodological naturalism fails if its premises are incorrect. In other words, if there is anything beyond the natural world, you will limit yourself and your ability to even consider the causes at play. That should be pretty obvious. Now, if you're looking at the mass of an atom or cardiac output or optimizing computer code, do you think it matters? No. But it does matter in quite a bit of this broader theory. So if you're interested in that, I would encourage you to look at Alvin Plantinga's work on where the conflict really lies. Okay, so with that, let's talk systems. So what I want you guys to do is get in your little tables and groups, and I just want you to talk a little bit about systems, what you maybe do as a student, some systems you've designed, some characteristics of systems, some strengths and limitations or challenges of systems. So this is you guys to just take 60 seconds, 2 minutes, and chat about systems.
I've been working on one right now.
So,
Wait, are any of you guys generally are testers?
That's a system.
Any of you guys say like a one system kind of like it has its purpose combines other systems.
trying to put, I guess you could say things together.
Always the best.
Say it's like, I'm trying to figure out how to use this. I couldn't figure it out.
I feel like computer code.
Projects where I read to put everything
It's a building block of the system, because if you just have code, it doesn't really have.
So the code is a system, but the computer is a system of systems, and the program is a system. So a computer running a program.
If they're working together to do something, but I mean,
Bucket you get when you put out a fire.
Right, totally.
it's not.
Or a team.
Physics
Functions.
Even if the function is something.
Like, how many do you think?
Mom, 10, 100?
Atoms.
I'd say it depends on system. But I think you could shooting from the system.
That's what I was wondering, like, how many could you?
Which is cells. Alright. How did you guys do? Alright, do you get your system vibe on? What are some key characteristics of systems? Multiple components, yeah. What?
Yeah, it serves some sort of function.
They have a specified function, yeah. What else?
Or an overall purpose.
Or an overall purpose, yeah.
Organized.
It's organized.
interdependence.
There is interdependence.
Step, process, a route,
What's that?
like a route, a process that goes.
Yeah, there is a process that by which those systems generally function, and it may be something that can be manipulated or altered. So when we manipulate or alter something, we would call that actuate. Yeah, we might actuate something, turn it on, and what if we want to adjust it? You put a rheostat in there, or a feedback loop. Yeah, so now we can regulate that system, right? So as you guys think about systems, in addition to all the parts that work together to perform generally some type of function or capability, and there's a way they operate, there are these processes. Also bear in mind that a lot of the times to make those systems operate optimally, we have to have control, right? Regulatory aspects. And that may even adjust the overall capability of a system, right? You may be able to use a motor to produce mechanical power, right? But also you might be able to use it to produce it's a dynamo, right? A motor is a dynamo. Okay. So you can produce electrical power. What else can you produce? Heat. Okay, thermal energy. So that can be something that you have to deal with or something that you're glad to have, right? And so there are all these capabilities, and if you want to integrate it optimally, you have a lot of work to do to figure out how to do that. All right. So I'm going to show you guys a really basic video of the cardiovascular system. It's almost embarrassingly basic. But how many of you guys have had some sort of introduction to, say, fluid dynamics? Yeah. What about some type of material science? What about electrical power and distribution systems? What about signal modulation and transduction? Alright? So as you guys are looking at this mundane video, I want you guys to be thinking about those things. And I'm totally putting myself out there. So this could go over like a fart in church. I want you guys, as you're watching this and afterwards, to think of some questions. And you're just gonna fire them at me. We'll go and we'll probably collect some, and then you guys can figure out what are the best ones. Say, how does the cardiovascular system regulate X, Y, or Z? Maybe it's pressure, flow, volume, fill in the blank. How is this structure of the cardiovascular system? What are its characteristics? Is it have a high Young's modulus? Is it, is it self-replenishing? What are the characteristics of it? How is that employed? And then what is, some function? How does the heart actually beat? How does the muscle actually contract? Whatever it is, you guys can pepper me with those questions, right? But we'll collect them, we'll see what the most interesting ones are for you guys. And then you'll see that no matter what you want to investigate, I can almost guarantee you that within the cardiovascular system, there is a pretty exquisite, finely dialed in system delivering that capability that you're asking about, okay? So, got your thinking caps on? All right. Then after we do that, we'll hit what I call the pièce de résistance, probably my favorite one. Okay. And let's see here. Again, apologize, this is kind of a lame video, but I did select it for a purpose. Let's see. I need to put the screen over here. Yeah. So one of the things I want you guys to think about is how the pumps in the pipe, the circuits, how it would have to be regulated, how would it support an organism. Think about some of those things and start getting your questions ready.
The heart and blood vessels make up the cardiovascular system, which delivers oxygen and nutrients to the body and removes carbon dioxide and waste products. The heart is a muscular organ with two upper chambers called atria that collect blood and two lower chambers called ventricles which pump blood out. Heart valves regulate the flow of blood through these chambers. The right side of the heart pumps blood returning from the body into the lungs where it picks up oxygen and delivers carbon dioxide. The left side of the heart pumps oxygen-containing blood from the lungs out to the body. The contraction of the heart muscle is controlled by electrical currents that start in the heart's pacemaker, known as the sinoatrial node, in the right atrium, and travels along precise pathways into the left atrium and down to the ventricles at a controlled speed. Abnormal heart rhythms, or arrhythmias, occur when heartbeats are irregular, too fast, too slow, or conducted by an abnormal electrical pathway. All blood is carried within the blood vessels. The arteries are strong and flexible and carry blood away from the heart under the highest blood pressure. Capillaries are tiny, thin-walled vessels that allow substances to pass between the blood and tissues. They also act as a bridge between the smallest arteries and veins, called arterioles and venules. Veins carry blood back to the heart and have much thinner walls than arteries due to their low pressure.
Now, the pressure's on you, and then very soon, the pressure's gonna be on me. Alright, so I want you guys to discuss, and I really am serious, I want you to use your engineering training, your knowledge of systems, your understanding of controls, your consideration of which parameters would be essential to maintain for an organism, and have some discussion, and then we're gonna take a throwing of spaghetti against the wall, and you're gonna write down these questions because I'm missing a hand, and then we're gonna see what you're most interested in. So there'll be no opportunity for me to cherry pick any of these, okay? So again, I'm throwing myself out there. But I think this will be fun engagement for you guys, and I'm looking forward to it myself. So have a chat, and then we'll pull those questions out.
Alright, regular teacher.
I was curious about timing, what makes it tick, especially considering.
I was curious about like the blood goes into the lungs, so it gets more oxygen, carbon dioxide. So I was thinking about like how exactly like it gets comfortable.
It's like a whole
So like kind of think about also like younger people have faster heartbeats and like as you get older it might get slower. Like the reason that happens.
But you're thinking good stuff.
Isn't there a part of your brain in the heart? Just like how it knows, how you know like what is the right time to leave the blood. Like how you know, like basically how fast. If you question like my head is 6 feet above my feet, how does it relate to how fast I'm But it's also like, because I feel like your pacemaker starts things off, but then it's like, what does, we already know about in between circuits. Yeah. Curious. If you didn't, if it went too fast into the lungs, you wouldn't transfer enough oxygen, right? But if it went too slow to your lungs, it would be efficient. Here's how much you matter later. Yeah.
It's a big matter.
What's what made up?
Oh, yeah, just after this war.
That's why he's got 20 layers of two.
Drink more water, you'll have more blood volume. One thing I know is that
Sitting right here,
so you gotta make that into a.
Why is it like?
How blood volume is regulated.
When you read it, I'm sure.
Taller, you can put it up.
How does your body know when, like, if you're running, you're doing something athletic, you obviously need more.
Okay, put that up there.
You need more oxygen.
Put that up there. How do you
Like, how does your
respond
blood
to?
know like how fast it is?
Hard to tell, it's perfect yourself.
That's like a good point.
On Saturday. All right, let's wrap up fairly soon here.
I think I personally think it's like the brain, right? So this brain is not like it signals out, right? Then you guys yourself develop.
Right. You know. I always wondered why do that's all.
Cause like this is the.
Because it throws the problem somewhere else.
Dioxide is feedback.
I wanna go all the way back to the
These are
beginning.
really, really good. You guys could be physiologists.
It's like
We've got a good resting heart rate for different.
But they're not as good for heart rate.
All right, so in interest of time, I'm gonna call it here. And we'll go through some of these questions. I'll probably pick the top two, okay? The top two. And before we go through them and before we get into any of the responses, I want you guys to consider something. Every component in every system that we have talked about or are going to talk about is a molecular machine of sorts, or a fairly complex molecular component, usually a protein, okay? Remember, a protein is made up of amino acids that are coded for on the DNA. There are 20 amino acids that are used, and so a random string of amino acids, you're gonna have 20 to the X to see what it is. Now, understand that to actually make a functional protein, it's not only the sequence, which is encoded in the DNA, which has to be snipped out and read just right, and not only string those amino acids together, but a lot of time that amino acid string, that polypeptide, would fold up on itself and produce non-functional nonsense. And so there are other specialized proteins, like chaperonins, that actually make sure it folds properly. So everything, whether it's a tissue type, a signaling agent, a receptor, or a cell, is made up of piles and piles and layers of proteins, each of which is extremely complex design based off of information that is stored, read out from, and then built from your DNA by incredibly complex molecular machines. Now, let's take a look at these. All right. What determines the electric signal? I really, really like that. But we can go beyond the deep end there. But I'll say there are leakage channels primarily for sodium and potassium. So the electrochemical gradients are determined by how many of these leakage or actuated channels are in the cells and what the net rate and net flux of those ions is. And it's perfect to ensure your pacemaker potential is just right, to keep your baseline resting heart rate at 100, then it's by vagal tone, which is a cranial nerve, it brings it down to 80. So anyway, we'll just do a drive-by on that. How does the pacemaker operate? There's a summary of that. What type of detector is there to detect CO2 and O2? That's primarily done by pH detectors in your cerebrospinal fluid. CO2 is rapidly converted to carbonic acid by carbonic anhydrase, which is all over the surface of your red blood cells. So your body gets a very accurate, but nevertheless slightly indirect level of detecting CO2 by your pH. And it adjusts your respiratory rate from your respiratory control center in your medulla oblongata by inferring the CO2 level from your pH. All right, so we'll just kind of do a drive-by on that one. How does blood know what to pick up or drop off? Well, everything follows the laws of chemistry and physics. However, it's an exquisitely manipulated and organized living system. So when you look at oxygen, hemoglobin has a quaternary structure. There are 4 subunits, a heme unit at the middle. That quaternary structure allows what's called chemical cooperativity. In other words, when one part actuates, the whole of it actuates. Hemoglobin has to transport and deliver oxygen, so it has to walk the tightrope of not holding onto it too tightly, because if you just carried it around, you couldn't deliver it. Now that cooperativity facilitates hemoglobin delivering all the oxygen at once down the simple concentration gradient of oxygen to tissues that have a relative oxygen deficit. Okay, so that one's simple, we'll move on. How would blood volume be regulated? I like that. I like all of these, but we'll put a mark on that. We may come back to that as one of the big two. Ooh, what makes a baby's heart start beating? Great question, but I've got a bombshell that's gonna be bigger than that, so we'll skip it. What pressure can the aorta withstand? Probably at least,
Why do you ask?
yeah. So, the problem here is your head will explode before your aorta. So a power lifter doing a maximal squat may produce systolic blood pressures well over 200 millimeters of mercury. As a matter of fact, maybe as high as 400 millimeters of mercury. And the risk for extremely high blood pressure is generally not aortic rupture unless you have aortic disease. It is stroke, because the vessels in your brain will blow out before your aorta. Your aorta is very, very strong, unless it's diseased. How do you regulate heat transfer in the capillaries? That's a good one, and a lot of it is local, right? And it's a combination of local and central. You have central thermoregulation capabilities in your thalamic nuclei, and then blood flow at the capillary levels is regulated by local control of including metabolites, in other words, things produced by living functions. Heat is actually a metabolite. As you do the work of life, you produce heat that actually facilitates dilation of those capillaries. Additionally, adenosine and other metabolites, including hydrogen ions, will open those capillaries and increase the flow. So you have a combination of local, central, and distributed regulation that does that. And understand that there are signaling molecules, several signaling molecules, as well as hormonal components through thalamic nuclei that affect our basal metabolic rate through hormones like thyroxine. And then in addition to that, we also have thermoregulation that's facilitated through our autonomic nervous system, which goes through our whole body, manages on one side on the sympathetic fight or flight, or hey, I'm just gonna go for a run now. On the other side, what we generally call rest and digest, okay? But blood volume, we can put a mark there, we may come back to it. Rhythm, pressure, and rate, oh gosh, I love this stuff. Thank you, whoever put that up there. Exercising, that's a good one. Yeah, how does it know to speed up, slow down? Okay, what do you guys want? Of the remaining ones, we'll do one or two deeper dives on one or two of the bigger questions.
We missed Luke's questions.
Oh, I see pressure.
That's fine.
So, before we go on, what are you guys seeing here? What are your observations? Other than this guy who likes to talk fast and you're not sure whether or not to believe him.
How does the body know how to process itself?
Yeah, that there is an exquisite set of regulatory and functional capabilities that appear as if the body knows what it's doing. And do you expect that those develop randomly? Would you infer that, or would you infer that they develop? So think about that, we'll come back to it. Last one, let's take a biggie. Which one?
Our star.
Oh, aerobic exercise. All right, let's do that. Yeah, I like that. Aerobic exercise, okay. The exercise response in the body and the cardiovascular system at large is primarily modulated through the sympathetic branch, which is your fight or flight branch of your autonomic nervous system, okay? What does that mean? It means you have two major ways of getting this information out to your body. One is through direct innervation. In other words, nerves with little fibers sending neurotransmitters, like epinephrine or norepinephrine, across a microscopic cleft to a receptor, again, a very complex and specific protein that only responds to that molecule or something that's very close to it. So you have a signaling mechanism there through the nervous system, and then you also have a hormonal component through the release of something into the blood that I'm sure you guys are aware of. Adrenaline or noradrenaline, okay? So that is produced by the renal medulla, okay? So adrenal medulla sits on top of your kidney and acts as a postsynaptic neuron. Developmentally and functionally, it acts as a postsynaptic neuron of the sympathetic nervous system. And when actuated by those fibers, it spills catecholamines, epinephrine, norepinephrine, into the bloodstream and bathes your entire body. Now, we have a problem here. Does epinephrine or norepinephrine, is that information? How does a tissue know how to respond?
Concentration
receptor. Chemical.
Yeah, there's a specific receptor type and a specific downstream response in a specific tissue. So now you're exercising fight or flight, same type of category. What do you think is going to happen to the blood vessels going to your digestive tract?
restriction.
Yeah, you're going to get vasoconstriction. Oh, you're going to have a disproportionate alpha receptors for those catecholamines there, which are going to make those smooth muscles and those vessels constrict. Because if you're running away from the bear or doing your jog, you don't need to maximize digestion. You need to put more blood flow to where?
Muscles.
Working muscles. And so you're going to have disproportionately beta receptors there, which are going to cause those blood vessels to relax, delivering blood flow there. Also, there's rich innervation of the sympathetic nervous system in the heart itself to increase the rate at which the heart beats. Leakage, and so that's going to be a mechanism called chronotropy, heart rate. It's going to change the leakage rate of those pacemaker cells, leak faster, increase the heart rate because it's going to depolarize more quickly. It's going to inhibit the rest and digest side through the 10th cranial nerve called the vagus nerve, acting on the sinoatrial node. It's going to inhibit that. In other words, it's going to take the foot off the brake pedal of the heart rate. And then additionally, you have, in addition to the rate of contraction, you have the force of contraction, what we would call inotropy. And so in the presence of sympathetic activation, the heart actually beats more forcefully. All right, I think that's enough considering the time, but that is only a partial small summary of what happens to prepare your body for exercise and allow your body to function in exercise. As a matter of fact, just thinking about that produced some of the effect. Okay.
Well, also you had mentioned earlier, increasing exercise produces more CO2 in the blood,
Yep.
which lowers the pH, and so you have that
That component as well, yes. Yep. And then you're gonna dilate airways in the lungs, everything works now. Your sympathetic nervous system works in sympathy with you, it is said. It kind of gets your vibe and goes with it. All right.
So you're saying that tissue decides what to do with the blood it receives based off of nerves and hormones?
That tissue is specifically equipped with all the signal receptors and actuating agents to have the exact response it needs for an exact situation. And that usually requires dozens of cascades of information leading to effects. Yeah. All right. Hey, we made it. All right. So hopefully that was fun. I'm going to finish in the cardiovascular system with what I call the pièce de résistance. Now I want you to think briefly about not the adult circulatory system, but the little bubby, the fetal circulatory system. What challenges are presented by gestation with regard to the cardiovascular system? Yeah.
You making a baby. You have to get nutrients and oxygen from the mother's bloodstream into the baby's bloodstream And you gotta have enough for her, and it's gotta cross the placenta.
Yeah, so the placenta is a pretty exquisite, multifunctional, multiplexed interactive system that has to handle all this exchange. So that's pretty complicated. What else? Where do we normally do gas exchange? Lungs. What's going on in babies' lungs? They're filled with fluid and developing. That's gonna be a problem. Does your heart normally pump blood to the lungs? Anybody see a problem with that? What do you think the resistance in the pulmonary circuit is for the developing baby? Very high, yeah. Alright, so I wanna show you guys the fetal circulatory system with some highlights. Now, these things that I have in red boxes are specific structures that are called shunts. They allow the blood to shunt from what we would typically call the right side of the heart or circulatory system to the left side. In other words, it bypasses the lungs. The lungs only need a tiny amount of blood flow for development. They don't need the full Monty for gas exchange. So, there's a structure here called the ductus venosus. I've dissected lots and lots of cadavers. You have that leftover from that structure sitting behind the liver, okay? So that's where you're gonna basically plug into the out the umbilical to the placenta, and you're gonna get oxygenated blood coming in that way from mom, from the placenta. Okay? That's gonna come up the inferior vena cava, which is normally where you have venous or oxygen poor blood coming into the body. Now that's your source of oxygen-rich blood. It's coming into the right side of the heart, which normally gets what kind of blood? Yeah, CO2 rich and oxygen poor. Now in the baby, it's got oxygen rich blood coming in to the right side of the heart. Now the right side of the heart usually receives blood from the body and then pumps it to the lungs. But what's going on in the lungs? Yeah, they're full of fluid, right? So what do? Well, we've got a convenient shunt, okay? A hole in the wall of the heart between the right and left atrium here called the foramen ovale that allows that blood to jet through from the right side to the left side. Now everything's just following pressure gradients, okay? Now that oxygenated blood has jetted from the right side to the left side, and the left side normally receives oxygenated blood back from the lungs and delivers it to the body. Okay, so now we're getting a little closer to what this baby needs, even though it's backwards from what you and I need. Okay? Now, this blood is then going to be pumped out the aorta, but there is also a mix of deoxygenated blood. Now, ultimately, the laminar flow produced here is going to make the most oxygen-rich blood go to the critical organs like the heart and the brain, which are really, really cool. So it doesn't perfectly mix like it normally would. Okay, there's a laminar flow and there are kind of distinct currents in there optimizing because you don't get a perfect oxygen solution here, right? It's a little bit of a compromise, but that what is perfected is how that laminar flow is managed to keep from crossing the streams too much and diluting that. Now, additionally, there's one last shunt, this ductus arteriosus, allowing blood that would have gone to the lungs from the right ventricle to loop back into the aorta. Okay? But it's actually after the most critical parts of the off ramps from the aorta. Pretty freaking cool, right? So, yes?
Is the heart then developed before the lungs in a baby?
They both develop at the same time, but the heart starts beating very, very early, but it's not fully developed. And the lungs generally are considered to develop later because they're not contributing to the development so much of anything else, whereas the heart is. All right. Okay, now there's one last thing that I want to throw out there. How does oxygen get from mom's blood to baby's blood? It can only go down what? A concentration gradient. In other words, the partial pressure of oxygen. It has to go down. You can never go uphill unless you're doing something called active transport, which we don't do with oxygen. So what if the baby had the exact same hemoglobin as the mom? Could you move oxygen efficiently from mom to baby? No, you couldn't. What's required to efficiently, as far as the hemoglobin, that oxygen carrying protein, what is necessary to move oxygen from the mom to the baby?
Low oxygen content in the baby.
So that's the gradient. What about the affinity for oxygen?
Yeah, if the fetal hemoglobin grabs oxygen more tightly.
Yes, fetal hemoglobin must have a higher affinity for oxygen than adult hemoglobin, or else you will never effect a sufficient transfer, right? And then guess what? It goes along with everything else. That mom's body will pretty much sacrifice everything to make a healthy baby. Now, in this case, fetal hemoglobin is completely, well, not completely, significantly different from adult hemoglobin. Okay? And it has a higher affinity for oxygen. It is necessary to affect the transfer of oxygen from the mom to the baby. Interesting, huh? But kind of obvious when you think about it, right? So I'm gonna leave that there, and we're gonna discuss the design inferences from the cardiovascular system in general. Would you consider them to be robust, absent, marginal, problematic? What do you guys think? Does the cardiovascular system and the human provide strong inference to design or not? Or somewhere in between? We've only scratched the surface. Do those systems and those control mechanisms and those components strike you as something that occurred by chance and accident, or the response of intent and intelligence?
I have a question. If the fetal hemoglobin is better at holding on to oxygen, why
not keep it?
Yeah, why not keep it?
Yeah, because hemoglobin has two jobs: transfer oxygen and
Remove carbon dioxide?
And be able to give up the oxygen.
deliver oxygen. It's not as good at delivering oxygen. So adult hemoglobin is actually more optimal, but you can survive with persistent fetal hemoglobin, and there are some gene editing approaches to taking people with serious blood disorders like sickle cell disease and getting them to persistently produce fetal hemoglobin as a solution to that. But great question, great question. But adult hemoglobin is better all around for adult life because it strikes a more optimal balance of transport and delivery.
As for your question, with what are the inferences, it seems to me that the cardiovascular system has some of the strongest arguments from irreducible complexity, because this is an integral system to every part of your life, and if the system isn't optimized in the way it is, the result is death. And so it would take quite a significant amount of time and quantity, I think, of organisms with this to develop, just through mutations, the ability to just die, and then suddenly it works really well.
Yeah, because I was just thinking about like one of the biggest things is like it has to be small incremental changes if it's like neo-Darwinism, but if you slowly integrate a system, it's not going to be perfected, so it's not going to work.
Yeah, so I like what he said. He recognizes that we've only talked about one organism.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you know a lot about the human body, that doesn't mean you know anything about the rest of animals, and you might be missing a lot of information for context. But the system clearly provides a strong inference of design, And I'd say what's unique about the fetal example? What's decisive about that? By the way, all those shunts have to go away almost immediately after birth or the baby's toast. Okay. If it doesn't all work just right, you can't have a single offspring. Okay. So I would say this is a very robust inference. This is, I'd say, much more decisive. Okay. Now, how far is too far? I'll just say you don't know what you don't know. I'd say these provide strong inference, but there's a lot you don't know. So be humble, enjoy it, but be humble with that. Sorry we've taken a little bit more time so far. So, but how far is too far? Could you go through any of these and make a leap and say, therefore God exists? Would that be justified?
For me, it's almost like, I think in the same way of just the heavens declare the glory of God. Look at this in my way of just like, it's something that shows a beautiful, intelligent designer. And
Yeah,
with
so
my
it
Christian
can give
background.
you a lot of confidence, right, and reinforce that, but it's not an airtight argument, right?
Yeah.
Science is based on probability anyway, and so when the probability is so small, it points to some sort of creator.
Yeah, or as ID would say, an intelligent designer. Now, one of the key differences between intelligent design as a concept and creation, intelligent design is taking inference, is looking at the natural world and saying, what can we infer from it? So it's working backwards through those observations. Creation is more saying, taking a worldview and working forwards, right? Now, you can see that they can meet in the middle.
Are there other candidates for intelligent designers besides God?
Sure. ID doesn't specify that beyond saying it has to be sufficient to be effective. The cause has to be sufficient to be effective.
You need
And these are pretty slick systems, right?
You need additional philosophical constructs to make the jump from deism to Christianity.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. So I'd say, I would say I would be careful about overplaying this. I think as Christians, we can have good confidence that there's a strong inference to design and that we can say, yeah, there is we can look through our arguments or through our worldview and say, yeah, I know who the designer is, it's God, but the argument doesn't quite get you there. And so don't overplay that hand because you're getting into a different, yeah.
I have a couple of professors, one in particular who I actually took an anatomy class, and he said, oh yeah, looking at like the fluid dynamics and the pump and everything, I have a hard time looking at this and believing that it evolved.
Right.
But he still believed that it did, or aliens. Like
Yeah.
another professor in the same department believes, and I was sitting in class just like, no.
Yeah, and so there's a worldview piece there, there is a pressure from the community there, and there's a saying that academia doesn't advance by discovery, it advances by the old guard dying off. And there's a really funny but really good paper called Academia's Golems, because whatever you grew up with, it's like, my precious, it's your livelihood, it's what you've committed your life to, and those are real things. And I would say that there are dogmatic problems in the Christian community as well, no question. Yeah.
If you rely too much on this and you leave yourself open to an accusation of having a God of the gaps. And I don't know, does everybody know what that phrase means? I don't even know.
It basically, we can't explain it, therefore God did it.
Yeah.
That's not an argument, and it's a God of the gaps statement. The reality is, so this is a great transition. Here are some suggestions. I hope you guys enjoyed this and got a lot out of it. I really would encourage everyone, myself included, to be humble, willing to listen, when we're talking in particular about the life sciences. There's a paradox here. The complexity and the breadth is so great and so remarkable that I feel like I haven't even scratched the surface. Okay. And so we all have a lot to learn, and if you studied in depth for a year and you run into somebody who's been a zoologist for 40 years, they're gonna break you in half off the top ropes because they're gonna say a bunch of things that you don't even understand. And they may be accurate, they may not, but there's a level of complexity that it's easy to think you're equipped and you're not. If you know a lot about humans, you don't know anything about the rest of organisms, you're not equipped, probably, depending on the engagement. If you know a lot about systems but don't know anything about molecular biology and biochemistry and information, you're probably not really equipped to optimally engage there. So I would just say be humble and careful and willing to learn. Okay. Don't overplay your hand. I would say avoid saying evolution is just a theory. You know, in the scientific arena, theory carries a lot of weight, and in our discussions here and there, theory doesn't carry a lot of weight. That's not an argument, and that's not gonna help you. So I would encourage to avoid that. And I'd just say be aware that a lot of scientists know very little about ID, other than they think it's BS. And so there are some terms, ID or irreducible complexity, that are gonna drive immediate emotional responses. And so what I would say is sometimes it's like, would you evangelize by trying to convince people that abortion is murder? Do you think that's a good avenue for evangelism? Usually not, maybe so. And so there are gonna be times where you're gonna get similar emotional responses. So if you're ready to engage and want to engage, I would consider terms like systems is great. And you can say, hey, I have a background in systems, and you can engage in systems discussion. Okay? And then the Socratic method can be really good. So here are some questions you could do. Hey, how does, I'm an engineer, and so, I've designed and built a lot of systems. I know a little bit about, Darwinism. How does evolution produce new systems? And I'll just tell you, you might get something that sounds like a good answer, and I can tell you there's currently not a good answer. And if you're digging in the wrong hole, digging deeper is not going to get you a better answer. Here's another one. So, I'm a programmer, or I've worked with coding and logic, and a lot of that's information, and I know just a little bit about DNA. It's a digital information storage and encoding retrieval system. Oh, pretty cool that it's error correcting as well. But how does evolution produce new biological information? And so these are very easy questions to become more knowledgeable about, and I think could be good in areas to humbly engage with your background. And then here's this one: is current evolutionary theory evolving? I mean, we've learned a lot since Darwin 170 years ago. And the fact of the matter is, yes, it's evolving, but not very effectively. There's a big movement called third wave evolution. The third wave evolution, which is basically a bunch of evolutionary biologists. They're not ID guys, they're not religious, and they have pragmatically accepted that the modern synthesis of neo-Darwinism is not sufficient, not even close. And so they're working to try to find other naturalistic means to fill those gaps. Okay? So you can look up, be familiar with third way and just that basic effort. And you could ask, hey, can you recommend some good books? And see if they're even aware of any of the leading minds in the ID movement. Sorry about the time. I've got some suggested resources up there. I do wanna have time for Q&A, but I recognize we've just hit our hour and a half mark. So I want people to feel free to go back to all the things that you need to do, that you can't do here.
So maybe how about I give an announcement or two, and then I'll pray us out.
Yep.
And then, since I imagine a lot of people will be interested in the questions and answers, you can just continue, and then people are free to, grab snacks and leave as you see fit. But I know you're wanting to do some Q&A. So let me just give an announcement or two. First one is next week we're meeting again, obviously, and the topic we're gonna have Carl speak, and it's gonna be kind of reviewing a video that someone made that sets up some points against Christianity and religion as a whole, and kind of makes a case for that. So we're gonna be breaking that down and seeing how do we respond to this? What is each claim really meaning? What do we say? It'll be discussional. So highly would encourage that. Yeah, Grant?
What's the video?
What do you call it, Carl?
Called Dear Believer.
Dear Believer. Yes, so that'll be next week. Additionally, we are whiteboarding again next week. So we'll be out there in the plaza. We'll send out a poll at some point during the week, and if you want to join, please do. We'd love to see you there. We're very encouraged by how many people have been coming. I hope it's a good time, that you've had good discussions. We're always wanting to hear about the discussions you have. If you have questions about what do we say to this, right? Or just encouragements of, I've been seeing this, or I had this conversation, it was awesome. Talk to us. We love hearing that. It's super encouraging. But yes, we will be whiteboarding, and the topic of the whiteboarding will be, can there just be one true religion? Or how can you say just one religion is true? Something along those lines. So if you'd like to do some research beforehand and you feel like, I don't really know what to say about this, let us know. Reach out to us. We'll try and give you some resources, things like that. Ratio Christi also has resources online, just as an organization. If you go to their website, if you click around somewhere, you can find, they have free little pamphlets. And they have lots of these questions that we typically talk about. So I'd also encourage looking there. But yeah, so that's next week, whiteboarding. I think that's everything.
Let me add two things really, really quickly that I think are important. One, you guys are about to be trained scientists or engineers of one sort or another. If you want to engage effectively and decisively in apologetics with that background, I would encourage the first place of engagement to be the Kalam cosmological argument. We were gonna go through that, but for in the interest of time, I think it's a much more robust and concise argument, and it also has much more requirements in the cause or agent of the effect to include timelessness and immateriality. And most non-Christians are unfamiliar with it, and it doesn't cause, people are more open to intellectually engaging it rather than emotionally engaging. So I would encourage you to investigate the Kalam as that first engagement arena for apologetics with a strong scientific component. And then here are also just a handful of the panoply of resources. I tried to condense a short list that I thought you guys might find most useful if you wanna, for starters.
I have a good picture.
And with that, I'm done.
Yeah, awesome. And that's all the announcements I have. So I'm gonna pray us out, and then see if I know a lot of you guys exam, so you can dash, but hopefully Dr. Huckstep will stick around for a little bit.
Yeah, I'll be here.
Alright, dear Lord, thank you for this evening. Thank you for Dr. Huckstep and just his mind, the years and years he's put into learning these things and sharing them. We're grateful for that, and we're just grateful for these systems, that we have such amazing biological systems within us that you have designed so carefully. So we praise you for all these things, and just what a joy they are to learn about. Be with each student here as they leave and go out. Help us as we study for exams and homework to not be too stressed about those, and to prioritize you above it all, and talking about you, letting others know about these wonderful, wonderful things. So in your name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Huckstep.
And wide-ranging questions.
That's for
Yeah.
So, that's kind of, doesn't often get
Just got a coding.
Heavily based.